Welcome all to my new channel and this new venture, and to kick things off, first project, first video, I'm going to take a Dell EqualLogic PS4000 from 2010 and I'm going to make it an Unraid server for Plex media library, transcoding, and possibly some VMs as well, but I'll look into that, but also some game servers. So here's the premise. And why this all started is I actually took my partner's old computer, which was housed in an Antec P280, I believe it's called. I'll put up an image on screen so you can see what it is I'm talking about. But it didn't have great airflow, and the chip that was inside it, which was an i7 4670K, which is still to this day an amazing processor. That might actually be an i5, I could be wrong on that one. But it's still amazing, like absolutely amazing chip, but it's very hot and it's not very efficient. We ended up replacing basically all of the internals. What I needed to do was to strip out the entirety of this Dell server, remove anything proprietary because it needed to house consumer parts. I wanted to be able to put my motherboard of choice, my power supply, etc. As it's a 3U, I was limited in terms of the height to a 120mm fan. It actually happens to be perfect because the internal measurement measured at 124mm. First thing we've got to do, we've got to design it. I've already taken down the measurements as accurately as I can, and I'm now going to put that into my favorite modeling tool of choice, and that's SketchUp, because it's free. What I'll do straight away is I'll just declutter and remove any of the components that are just placeholders for now, and then show you it's not pretty, it needed to be as basic as possible, but just to show you again, that gap in the front, 124mm, great for the fans, going to be perfect. The actual overall width of the case, if we're not including the ears on the side, it's about 447, and then depth is around 538. Once I had virtualized all of the components inside, I was happy to make some sacrifices in terms of its footprint, just for how versatile this was going to be. Because at the end of the day, if I'm modding this case to my needs, I could make it as versatile as I want it to be. The first thing to do was to get some drive cages and also just get a general idea of like how many drives could I get in this case. I found these drive cages online. They didn't cost a lot, and I wanted 3 of them because once I combined the measurements of all 3 of them, they basically fit perfectly in front of the case. I could mount them all together, and I did. The existing holes that were in the sides of these drive cages actually lined up perfectly, so I could just put in a couple of nuts and bolts, tighten them down, and they were mounted as one unit, so then I could slide the whole thing in through the front. Let me just put the components in so you can get like a general idea of the layout. This is the one that I settled with. If I remove the GPU from the equation, and the GPU is very optional because I don't plan on doing transcoding using the GPU. Right now I'm doing the CPU. The power supply is purely placeholder imagery in this case, just so I can get an idea of the cable management possibilities, or lack thereof, I should say. And then the hard drives in the front, I've only put 3 in each of the bays for now, just to give me an idea of the spacing and what it's going to look like. Quite happy with it. And then by the time I put the fans in the front, again, just give you an idea of how that mounting is going to look. There is quite literally 2mm between the top and bottom of the fans once you put them in the front of the case. However, there were some hurdles to overcome, so I'm going to walk you through now what each of those are. The first thing I wanted to do is get that front off, and then by the time I've got the drive cages, so at this point I already had all 3 of them kind of mounted together, and I just slotted them in through the front. They weren't all the way because there were some rivets in the way. I had to like grind those down. And these drive cages did come with these grills on the front. This was really good for just visualization because now I could see what it could look like. I actually decided not to go with these grills because the grills themselves stick out probably about that much. And that's just adding more bulk to the case. I'm trying to trim it down as much as possible, damn it. Problems to overcome were the sheer amount of rivets that this case had. And for the most part, especially the ones on the side, they could just be drilled out, didn't need a Dremel or anything like that. But the ones on the inside, most of them, okay, could just be drilled out, yes. but certain ones which were structurally integral. They kept the sides and the top and bottom together. What I could do is I could grind them down so that they're flat enough that the drive cages, when I slide them in, could kind of jump over them. Once the drive cages are in place and where I want them to be, they will be screwed to the sides of the case anyway, so the drive cages aren't going to move, but it's getting over that hurdle, getting them in the case to begin with. I ended up taking a Dremel and I just ground their suckers down. Yeah, I know there's probably different ways that you could do that. I tell you what though, it does make for a great light show. Now was the fun part, because of course I had to have a window to not only look good, I obviously want to show off what all the hardware is inside, but it also makes installation of all the hardware inside much easier, because I could just slide everything in through the top. You know, take the rivets out, cut the top off, and already I was thinking, man, this is going to be so cool when it's done. And I could now slide hard drives and GPUs, and the GPU I have in here is an R9 290 or 280, I think. R9 290, and I think this is actually a fairly sizable card. Yes, okay, nowadays we have larger graphics cards, but this actually just gives me a good representation of what kind of card I can fit in, and that's, you know, it's a sizable card. I don't intend to put a GPU in it, but I could. Right now the difficulty is finding a motherboard that supports bifurcation, and that is taking a single PCIe slot and then turning it into multiples. But that's a bit of a ways out, and actually there are boards that exist that do that, but they're incredibly expensive, and I was on a bit of a budget. But here, I'm just going to show you on the back that there is this column that is in the back, even if I don't remove that. But if I did remove it, it gives me unimpeded access to the entire back of the case. So I could slide whatever hardware I want into it. So if I do have a ridiculously long GPU I want to install in this case, I could slide it in through the back. So one nicety with these drive cages is they have mounting holes specifically for 120mm fans, but what they don't accommodate for is where to pass the cable through. I assume it's because they would say they would want you to have the cable pass through either the top and bottom. I ended up taking out a little notch. This ended up becoming completely pointless because later on I end up cutting off these ears that hold the fans on anyway. So even though I did have a test fit earlier with the motherboard in there, there wasn't actually any standoffs in it. So I took the time on the reverse side of the case, marked out all of the places where the standoffs needed to be. So here's a motherboard that I decided to go with. It's an ASRock Riptide B760M, and it worked perfectly fine. It wasn't expensive, and it's got more or less the expansion slots that I need right now. So there are two M.2 slots, and one could just be used for the boot drive. If I decide to go down that route, I could offload Unraid onto an M.2 if I wanted to. And of course, a lovely shot of the Intel i5 12500T, which I'm very happy with. It's a 6-core, 12-thread, great little processor. It consumes next to nothing in terms of power. I think it's like under 40 watts, maybe 45. So I'm already very impressed with it. It's not very power hungry. It doesn't get hot at all. That thing is super chilly. Even when you hit it with 100% load. If I ask it to transcode our Plex media library, yeah, it stays at 100% pretty much the whole time, and the temperature just does not budge, which is a great sign. Of course, I have to show you the whole system up and running with the tacky ARGB fans that I happened to purchase, but again, they were cheap. That thermal right cooler that I put on it, which is a slimline flat one, is actually awesome. I love this cooler, and I'm so glad that I went for it. The slim 120 that's on top of it will probably end up replacing with a slightly thicker one, and then the ones on the front, swap those out for the Arctic P12. Because I don't need the ARGB. There's one less cable connector for each of the fans, because already we're up to 6. Well, 8 if you include the CPU one. And then otherwise I could just cut that in half if I just had the Arctic fans in the first place. Oof. Okay, very quickly. On a side, this is the LSI RAID card that I'm using to plug in all the SATA connections for my hard drives. Because even though right now I only have like 5 drives, that's enough to overwhelm that MATX board, I believe, because that motherboard only has 4 SATA connections on top of it. Now I know it exists, you can get an M.2 and then you can break that out into multiple SATA connections, but in this case I just happen to have an LSI RAID card, and then it has 2 SAS connections on it, and each of those breaks out into 4 SATA connections. And that's great. That gives me 8 drives worth of capacity, plus the additional 4 on the motherboard itself, which means I have 12 potential drives worth of cables. But here's a fun fact. This LSI RAID card would not boot unless I had put tape over pins 5 and 6. Yeah, I found one article online that had this solution. At this point, I had the standoffs installed, and then I could put the motherboard in, get a feel for the sizing, and everything was looking really good at this point. I was feeling so happy with the layout. But here it comes a crossroad that I just had to decide, because I was running into difficulties whenever I was trying to install test drives on the inside, because the way that the drives were mounted, you could access the top and bottom of the clips to be able to release the hard drive from the cage, and that was just not working, because also by the time I slide the hard drive out, it was hitting the motherboard, and I don't want to have to remove the motherboard and all connectors to be able to get the hard drive out. That doesn't make sense. So this was a design problem that I should have anticipated happening. Flip it. So have it so that they mount through the front of the case as opposed to on the inside of it. And that was an absolute game changer, and I'm so glad that I, first of all, didn't commit to painting beforehand, because at this point I was feeling so good about the project, I was just ready to paint, slap everything in and call it a day. But then I found this problem, and then I pondered on it for a couple of days thinking, wow, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? But yeah, just flipping the drives around so you mount them through the front makes a lot of sense, because the only thing that's in the way then is the fans, and they can be easily removed. Although that's where those ears then had to be cut off, because they would then be on the inside of the case. And the cables have to go through them. That's not going to work. So by flipping these hard drive cages around, so that I could access the hard drive from the front, had one massive benefit to this whole project and the case in itself, because the footprint was still very big. Wasn't that happy with it. What am I kidding? I was happy irrespective of this benefit that I discovered. But that is now, because I don't need to access anything through the inside, and I don't need that buffer to be able to slide the hard drives out of, I could slide the cage all the way in. Almost butting up against the edge of the motherboard, and that gave me probably like that much space in the front of the case that was no longer being used. So what I did is I cut the front of it off, and it felt good, because all of a sudden the case went from a slightly bigger than I would like footprint to I am absolutely happy with how big this case is. Where it is now by my feet fits perfectly on that shelf. The cages can now be butted up all the way on the inside, and that's great. The fans now have to sit in front of the cages as close as they can anyway, without them hitting the retention clips for the hard drive sleds. Now, that wasn't the biggest problem. It's actually just now, how do I mount the fans? Because I don't have those ears as part of the cages to be able to mount them directly to it. I fabricated some long L bracket, essentially angle plates, to mount the fans to, and this was actually really good, because then I could take these strips of L-shaped metal and mount all 3 fans at once, and then put the whole assembly, a little bit like the hard drive cages themselves. I could take the whole fan assembly out in one go and put it back in, and then hold them down with, you know, some screws, some nuts and bolts, which is actually how I ended up doing it. I had 4 nuts and bolts, 2 in the top, 2 in the bottom, and that works just fine. I'm really happy with that. And those L-shaped pieces of metal weren't cut off from the front, so I didn't have to bend them. But what I did is I took those slides that this server would sit on in a rack, and because they had that L-shaped profile already, I could just cut that off, and then that was my mounting plate for the fans. So that worked out really nicely. Yeah, this upcycling made me really happy with the project. I wasn't running out of resources, because there was always something lying around as a leftover that I could use to speed the project along. Motherboard's in, I've tested it with the power supply, etc. Everything is coming together just fine. She's sanded, she's ready for painting. You know how you see in painting factories, etc. They hang everything off of hooks, and then they kind of slide it into a chamber and they spray it down like that. I ended up just taking some coat hangers, cutting them up, bending the metal to how I want it to be, and then I could hook the case onto them, as well as the fan mounts themselves. I ended up painting those as well. With the whole theme of this, everything inside of it is pretty much matte black. But anyway, yeah, it was great. The finish came out really nicely. I'm super happy with it. And we ended up with the product that you're now seeing. Here's the finished list of what I need to do to the case for it to be completely done and dusted. Speaking of dust, there needs to be a filter on the front, which I intend to use some more cut-off parts, a little bits of metal that magnetically snap to the sides of the case on the inside where the fan mounts are. Acrylic window for the top. I will need to order that or buy some acrylic and cut it myself. Don't know how much of a fine job I can do. My experience with cutting acrylic, not great. I'm sure if I take my time and use the correct jigsaw bits, that will certainly help a lot. And then I need to create a panel for the back, and that's to fit the I/O shield for the motherboard, as well as a proper clamp for anything PCI related, because currently it's literally just in the slot. There's technically nothing to stop it from falling out, but luckily there isn't anything pulling it up, so it shouldn't come out. And then the power supply right now is just kind of sat there on some foam pads to stop it slipping around. That will need to be mounted securely as well. So the whole back needs doing. I don't want this to be a multi-part video, but the next one will be the finale with the window, all of the back panel, the magnetic mesh, hopefully with some more hard drives in there as well, because currently there's only three Iron Wolf Pros, 4 terabytes, and one of them's parity anyway. And then I've got 2 SSDs, not M.2s, 2.5 inch drives that I intend to replace because they don't have DRAM in them, and I will be replacing them with M.2 SSDs for the cache. But anyway, thank you for watching this first part of my Unraid build project on this Dell EqualLogic PS4000. The production for this video, yeah, I can appreciate just having pictures isn't the best, so for the second part, a lot of that will be video as opposed to static images, because I didn't actually know if I was going to fully commit to making a video. But if you have actually stuck with me until the end of this video, thank you, and I hope you found it entertaining. Look out for part 2, because that is going to be the completed project on this Dell EqualLogic case, and I've had an absolute blast working on it, and it's not over yet. But thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.